Hello everyone, welcome back to the Chanel. In a world where the thin line between deterrence and escalation can be crossed in a single night, what unfolded in this fictional account reads like a warning and a lesson at once. A series of precision campaigns launched from the territory of a smaller, technologically adept nation that targeted strategic nodes across a larger adversary's infrastructure and produced cascading blackouts, disrupted logistics, and forced a global conversation about how modern conflict is waged. This is not a report of real events, but a fictional analytical narrative designed to explore how modern arsenals, tactics, and resilience measures interact when a high-tech offensive meets a sprawling, interconnected society. It is meant to examine exterior effects that are visible to the public, the interior systems of planning and control that make such campaigns possible, the performance characteristics of the technologies involved, the safety and ethical constraints modern forces attempt to observe, the unique selling points, the competitive advantages of new systems, the true price paid in material and human terms, and a concluding appraisal of what such a shift in capabilities means for states, civilians, and the international order. From the outside, the exterior image of this campaign was stark and cinematic. At dusk, whole districts that had been lit for decades blinked out in waves. Traffic signals froze. Apartment buildings fell into silence except for the hum of emergency generators, and news feeds filled with footage of darkened industrial zones and empty railway yards. Power plants that once stood as monolithic symbols of national strength were reduced in the public imagination to vulnerable nodes on a map. The visible effects drove home the essential truth of contemporary conflict. Modern societies are held together not just by armies and borders, but by webs of critical infrastructure that, when struck, can produce effects more immediate and politically potent than many conventional military operations. The exterior narrative is driven by optics. The image of Blackout, the image of halted trains, the image of hospitals on emergency power, and the image of a populace suddenly confronted with the fragility of everyday systems. Those images shape public perception and, by extension, political responses. They are also the point of leverage for a state seeking to impose cost without committing to a full-scale occupation or prolonged ground campaign. In short, the exterior shows what the public sees and feels, the immediate, sensory consequences that make infrastructure attacks both powerful and controversial. Beneath the visible layer in the interior of the fictional military apparatus, a compact but highly networked command structure coordinated action through layers of intelligence fusion, decision support tools, and legal oversight mechanisms. This interior paragraph must be short. Planners integrated multi-source intelligence, ensured civilian risk assessments were part of target vetting, and maintained legal review to the extent possible within the story's constraints. That short description of the interior is central. Successful operations of the type described depend less on brute force than on high-quality information, sped-up decision cycles, and a doctrine that aims to synchronize effects rather than scatter them. The interior systems included simulation models predicting knock-on effects, continuity of government plans to mitigate destabilizing outcomes, and communications architecture that tried to minimize misinterpretation and reduce the chance of unintended escalation. Performance in this fictional account is measured across several axes: precision, reach, tempo, and the integration of kinetic and non-kinetic means. Precision is the headline, the ability to strike narrowly defined infrastructure components, a substation, a critical transformer, a control center, without creating. Safety features in the arsenal and in the rules governing its use were emphasized repeatedly by the fictional nation's leadership in public statements and internal doctrine. The narrative here stresses that modern militaries seeking legitimacy attempt to incorporate safeguards, target discrimination protocols designed to avoid protected sites, abort mechanisms allowing munitions to be retasked or self-neutralized when civilian concentrations are detected, and legal review layers intended to ensure compliance with the law of armed conflict. In the story's framework, Certain systems incorporated geofencing to avoid urban centers and software locks to prevent misuse. Commanders relied on multiple confirmations, human and machine, before authorizing action. These practices reflect a larger trend. As destructive potential becomes cheaper and more accessible, states have incentives to show restraint and to develop procedural controls that limit collateral harm. Yet the narrative also recognizes the limits of these safeguards. Even the most careful targeting can trigger cascading infrastructure failures with humanitarian consequences that are hard to foresee and harder to contain. The unique selling points of the fictional forces approach lay in agility, cost efficiency, and the creative repurposing of commercial technologies for defensive and offensive ends. Agility meant the ability to change tactics rapidly in response to electronic warfare or air defense adaptations. Cost efficiency was a strategic advantage because lower-cost drones and precision loitering munitions can impose disproportionate defensive expenditures on an adversary, forcing them to spend expensive interceptors and invest in redundancy, where previously a single system might have sufficed. The creative repurposing of off-the-shelf components, cameras, guidance chips, and communications modules, accelerated innovation cycles and diffused capabilities across an ecosystem of small firms and academic labs. This decentralization of innovation meant that weaponization was as much an industrial policy story as a military one. The attacker's toolkit also emphasized modularity. Systems that could be reconfigured for reconnaissance, electronic attack, or strike roles as the tactical situation demanded. Finally, the strategic narrative stressed that combining non-lethal effects, such as targeted outages that pressure industrial supply chains, with kinetic options created a menu of coercive choices that stopped short of total destruction but achieved political leverage. When considering price, it is essential to move beyond the narrow measure of procurement costs and consider the total cost of operations: economic, humanitarian, diplomatic, and reputational. Materially, the fictional campaign was cheaper for the attacker than a protracted conventional war. Low-cost loitering munitions and drones, when combined with careful intelligence, delivered effects that would have once required large air assets and support structures. For the defender, however, the price was steep. Immediate financial costs included emergency repairs, the deployment of temporary power solutions, and the allocation of scarce repair crews. There was also a broader economic ripple effect as factories halted, perishable goods were lost, and logistics chains adjusted to reduce throughput. On the humanitarian side, even though medical facilities largely operated on backups and emergency protocols, patients dependent on continuous treatment faced risks, and vulnerable communities, the elderly, those in remote areas, experienced disproportionate hardship. Diplomatically, the campaign forced neutral and allied states to choose stances, provide aid, or condemn methods, introducing political costs that could, but not be easily quantified in currency. Reputationally, the attacker balanced on a knife edge, claiming surgical precision and an ethical approach, while critics warned of normalized infrastructure. Ethical and legal questions permeated every part of the story. The fictional state argued that denying an adversary the ability to wage operations by targeting military logistics nodes embedded in wider systems was a legitimate form of contestation. Opponents countered that when essential services are disrupted, the civilian population pays the price, and international humanitarian norms must prevail. The narrative here deliberately avoids graphic detail and instead focuses on the policy debate. How to weigh military necessity against humankind's shared interest in preserving life-supporting infrastructure. The story explored how international organizations, legal scholars, and non-governmental actors responded. Some calling for new treaties to protect power grids and communications, others urging the development of rapid humanitarian response frameworks to cushion civilians from disruptions that are increasingly likely in future conflicts. Resilience and adaptation were major themes on the defensive side. Faced with targeted disruptions, utilities and industry implemented rapid measures. isolating damaged substations, deploying mobile generation units, and invoking blackout prioritization protocols to preserve critical services like hospitals and water treatment plants. These measures are part of a broader doctrine of resilience that modern states now pursue. Redundancy built into systems, microgrids that can operate independently, and hardened control systems with manual override options. The fictional narrative highlights the ingenuity of engineers and emergency managers who, under pressure, devised temporary routing solutions and restored limited services quickly. At the same time, the story notes that resilience has limits. Creating full redundancy across an entire national grid is prohibitively expensive, and political leaders must balance investment in resilience with other budget priorities. The result is a patchwork of capability. Some regions can bounce back fast, others remain vulnerable for longer periods. Information and perception management played a pivotal role. The attacking state sought to frame its actions as precise, targeted, and aimed at military infrastructure, while the defending state framed the campaign as indiscriminate aggression against civilians. Media narratives and social media amplified both claims, and disinformation campaigns on both sides muddied the factual picture for international observers. The fictional analysis stresses that in modern conflicts, narratives can be as consequential as physical strikes. Public sympathy, the willingness of allies to provide support, and domestic cohesion all hinge on how well each side controls the story. The narrative also highlights an emergent fact. Independent verification mechanisms, open-source analysts, satellite imagery, and on-the-ground reporting have become critical in sorting truth from propaganda. The story underscores the growing role of neutral verification nodes and the pressure they exert on belligerents to adhere to declared standards of engagement. Technological evolution is central to the tale. A generation ago, hitting a power grid required large air campaigns or sabotage behind lines. Now the convergence of guidance systems, small airframes, and affordable sensors allows a diversity of actors to threaten infrastructure at scale. Yet technology is not destiny. The fictional nation's success derived as much from doctrine and governance as from gizmos. Clear rules of engagement, legal oversight, investment in intelligence, and rehearsed contingency plans enabled effects to be calibrated. Conversely, the defenders' eventual recovery depended on the decades-long investments in grid modernization carried out by engineers who anticipate, to some extent, the possibility of deliberate disruption. The story makes clear that technological advantage can be transient. Once a technique is demonstrated, countermeasures proliferate, and the economics and industry lessons are drawn carefully. Corporations with distributed manufacturing centers fared better than those with single, centralized production hubs. Supply chains that had been optimized for cost rather than resilience showed critical weaknesses. The fictional account suggests that businesses will increasingly invest in redundancy, insurance, and scenario planning, a market response that could, over time, raise societal resilience but also increase costs for consumers. Insurance markets themselves reacted, premiums for critical infrastructure coverage climbed, and new financial instruments emerged to underwrite resilience projects. These economic shifts highlight another truth. Warfare that targets infrastructure can be weaponized not only for immediate tactical gain, but for long-term economic pressure. Diplomatically, the campaign altered alliances and conversations about the norms of conflict. Some states condemned the approach outright. Others, sympathetic to the attackers' security concerns, issued guarded support while urging restraint. Multilateral forums convened emergency sessions to discuss norms and potential measures to minimize harm to civilians during infrastructure-focused operations. The fictional narrative underscores how such events prompt institutional responses, calls for new norms, the strengthening of humanitarian contingency mechanisms, and debates about deterrence in an era when critical infrastructure is a battlefield. In the final analysis, the conclusion of this fictional study is sobering and double-edged. On one hand, precision capabilities and the integration of modern technologies allow smaller powers to impose meaningful pressure on larger adversaries without committing to conventional defeat or occupation. This can be a stabilizing advantage for states that face existential threats and lack traditional military power.